Part 1. The Usurper. What if I could put them in front of you, the ones that hurt her? If I could guarantee that you'd get away with it, would you kill them? Chapter 1. Taboo until you sleep. To the best of her recollection, the first time she died, it happened like this. Aisha was lying in bed, and there was a letter half covered under a vase with red roses on the nightstand beside her bedroom window. The beginning of the letter was indistinguishable, but the bottom half was caught in a feeble early evening moonlight. It was signed Dr. Jimmy Butcher. Even if his announced death after the war was a relief for the public, Aisha knew best than to believe he was finished. If he is indeed alive, he will stop at nothing, and there will be blood on her hands too. He will be partly responsible for his atrocities. This guilt was triumphing over her for several weeks now. Without him, her life's work felt pointless. Outside, all was calm except for the small raindrops on the glass, and she felt, as she did on the evening of his departure, an irresistible urge to stay in the warmth of her sheets, as if only sleep could ease her pain when the night came. The wind started howling as the thunder rumbled and the rain hit her window panes. The vast cloak of clouds blocked view of the starry sky, amplifying a suffocating melancholy to the comfort of her pillow, leaving her lying restless. She could distinguish the heavy rain drops in the distance, as if the noises that reached her distorted ears dilated and filled her mind, as the hissing of the wind through the entrails of the window carried her snuggled in the warm wool towards sleep, leaving the world. Seconds later, her feet landed on what felt like cold fresh soil, and she drew a breath of what smelt like forest wind. When she opened her eyes, she perceived a rough landscape without horizon, where some kind of a black sun shaded the grey nest. In terror, Aisha started screaming for help, but her voice was smothered, and when she tried to run, her feet were barely touching the ground, and after more minutes of phenomenal effort, she came to a halt deep into this darkening forest, where the only source of light was an exceptionally large silver moon throwing shade on thick large trees. She looked around and kept doubting the reality of these events. Without fully realizing what was happening, she perceived in the distance a large wooden cabin on an enlightened patch in the middle of the trees. All around her, darkness thickened on the woods and strange noises echoed from small creatures that crept through the thickets. As she approached the light, she got closer to it. The old cabin loomed over her, its wooden walls covered in grime and neglect. Moonlight illuminated the front door, revealing the ornate carvings that had long since lost their luster. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting visitors inside. When she pushed the door, the air she breathed was thick with dust and a faint scent of old wood. The dark wooden walls creaked with age as she stepped out of the shadows and into the dimly lit hallway. Her footsteps echoed on the wooden floor as she reached the foot of the staircase. The silence of the house was broken only by the distant sound of a clock ticking away the seconds. Suddenly, she felt like she wasn't alone in the darkness, and the air was thick with an unspoken tension, as if the very walls of the place were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Her eyes were fixed on the empty hallway as the staircase trembled, and at the end of the hallway, a door swung open, revealing a chimney-lit room as she was taken by the crackling noises of a fire. "Hello," she yelled. "Is there anybody here? Help me, please." But there was no answer. She was shivering with a mixture of cold and terror as she entered the room. Unlike the rest of the cabin, the room was tidy, and many bookshelves were decorating the walls. Aisha turned towards the chimney and could distinguish a presence, the muscled back of a man. Though his face was not visible, her legs trembled with overwhelming reassurance. Somehow, she knew it was him. She knew he was visiting her. "Jimmy, you're alive," she said. But when he turned, the murderous look in her lover's eyes made him almost unrecognizable. In the 8 years they spent together, she never saw him in this state. He scared her, although only moments ago, all she craved was being next to him. She threw herself on him to hug him, but he held her arms. "What happened?" she said, as she put her cold hands on his warm face. "What is this place?" "You'll see," he said, putting his thumb on her forehead, and when she felt his cold touch on her skin, as if an electric pulse shocked her mind, visions started flashing in front of her. The first day they met, the shitty apartment in St. Petersburg, a handsome library and scattered papers on the floor as she perceived from the window the silhouette of a young woman approaching the edge of a hill. The woman turned, and she could distinguish her pale face, almost ghostly, and her untidy black hair billowing in the wind, and suddenly, Fire burst out around her as an explosion followed by the loud screams of a woman almost burst her eardrums. Seconds later, she opened her eyes in rubbles. Her entire body was aching as she struggled to emerge from the dust. And when she turned, she saw him again. Jimmy was kneeling down in the distance, near what seemed to be a child. Unable to speak, Aisha could barely lift her arm to reach for him. And as soon as he looked at her, Jimmy stood up and was now approaching her. If this gesture, as natural as it is, somehow proved to her that he still loved her. She burst into tears, pleading, "Jimmy, Jimmy." As his image filled her vision, Aisha took a deep breath and twisted her sheets as she felt his presence near her body. She was being pulled upwards from the bed by an invisible force, and although no one was in the room, she was being fucked. She was being fucked in the forest as she saw Jimmy walking through the woods, semi-naked, fucking her over a tree, and after what felt like long hours. Covered with sweat, Aisha started crying out back in her bedroom, frightened, reciting the Lord's Prayer. "Hallowed be thy name." Her eyes closed as she began to speak softly but quickly, trying to break the spell. "Deliver us from evil, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen." But still, she felt pleasure deep inside. Her incantation was useless. She opened her eyes, now alone in the forest, exhausted by what felt like hours of fucking. She couldn't think nor speak, and the bleak darkness of the woods engulfed her while chasing a presence that she no longer felt. Suddenly, she heard a slight rustle behind her. In the distance, pebbles and creatures were fleeing breathlessly from the current underneath the boots of Jimmy as he prayed at the presbytery of demons. Some strange words that boasted false prowess, and after a while, silence invaded the earth once more before his low voice spoke. "What am I to you, Aisha? Why do you care about me? Am I not the enemy?" Her hand shaking, she reached for him, holding him tight. "Don't leave me, please, Jimmy. I'm sorry. You can rest now, Aisha. For in due time, I will kill them all." He suddenly pulled a silver dagger from its handle and rammed it into her chest. He almost felt like lightning strode through her chest as she felt this excruciating pain, paralyzing her movement, the blade piercing her heart, drowning in her blood. She started falling into the bleak darkness of death. The echo of his undistinguished voice filled her brain as she passed through a void of light at such speed that her body felt flattened into a subatomic contrail. She was leaving towards a cosmic loudmouth, so vast and so dense, a galaxy eater, possessing her in such force to tear apart the fabric of space and time, to obliterate reality. And in she went, bursting into trillions of tiny particles, quadrillions of whining fleas consumed, being now a thing with one arm, then with one leg, then with 20 legs, and now a headless pair of legs, then a bodiless head. Her parts dissolved, and no outline would be visible in the dense terror within which her consciousness melted. But the strangest thing of all was that, from the top of her head, there sprang a bright and clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and it was no doubt the occasion to resort, in the dullest of moments, to simply open her eyes when Aisha finally woke. Looking up from the bed, she could barely make out the transparent window against the opaque walls of her room. The darkness slowly faded as her eyes fixed on a flickering light emanating from the direction of her chimney. Looking up from the bed, she could barely make out the transparent window against the opaque walls of her room. The darkness slowly faded as her eyes fixed on a flickering light emanating from the direction of her chimney. Looking up from the bed, she could barely make out the transparent window against the opaque walls of her room. She was trying to pierce the darkness with her ferret eyes, when the chime of a nearby church hit for quarters. So she listened to the time. She sat up in bed, breathing heavily, shook. She saw that there was a fire burning brightly in the fireplace. Struggling to remember what happened, she blinked a few times, thinking that maybe she was still dreaming. But as she looked around her room, she realized that she was definitely awake. On her right, a thick document was lying under the vase on her bedside table. Her heart started to race as she picked it up and saw that it was addressed to her. "Dear Aisha, I am writing this letter to inform you of my intentions. For a number of years, you and I have been engaged in an ongoing project which I believe to be of great importance. Prometheus Hermes, the anti-atomic technology, and its implications on the world in order to gain the attention of the public and the authorities to this issue. I have resorted to what some might call illegal activities or terroring. However, I prefer to think of these actions as an unconventional and necessary means to an end. Enclosed is a manuscript that outlines my thoughts and beliefs regarding this matter. I request that you publish this document to initiate a public debate and raise awareness of the issues at hand. In exchange for the publication of this document, I will cease my activities indefinitely. Please understand that my actions are not intended to harm innocent people, but rather to put a stop to the destructive nature of this technology. Publishing my message, we will finally vanquish the enemy. Sincerely, Jimmy Butcher.
Get your hands off of me, wanna rest my palm.